Welcome back, pod people. My guest today is Nina Nesseth, the author of Nightmare Fuel, The Science of Horror Films, which is a great little pop sci book about the science of horror films, as you may have guessed. She's not herself a filmmaker, but I think she has a bunch of interesting insights, and if you are new to this sort of analysis of films, or if you have any friends that you want to try to get interested in horror films or in the analysis of films in this sort of way, I definitely recommend picking up a copy. Thank you for coming onto the show, Nina.
Thanks so much.
So, first, a bit of a framing device for this conversation. My intention is not to rehash the contents of the book. If anyone out there listening is interested in that, my recommendation is to go read the book itself. Instead, I want to talk a bit about what's not in the book and about how you decided what things should and should not be in the book, things like that. So, my first question is, was there anything that you had wished you could have included in the book, but didn't for some reason?
Not so much that it's something that I it's an interesting question, because the thing that I wish I could have included but couldn't, it wasn't because um, there wasn't room for it in the book. What I wish I could have included was more definitive answers as to why people who love horror, which is the book posits a lot of theories and some that are very strong theories, but science is still out on why people who love horror love it the way they do, or what makes horror special as a genre. And that is really the crux of what the book is trying to explore, and gets to a lot of it. But at the end of the day, the answer is kind of like there are a lot of reasons why a person might like horror, and some of them are psychological and physiological, and some of them just come down to personality. And I wish, like any scientist, there's never, but we always hope for some pat answer that could really define things for us. But as what is also true about science is that it rarely comes down to one pat answer to explain something.
Yeah, thinking about why I like horror, there's obviously multiple different reasons. And one of the ones I think you sort of touched on a little in the book, but didn't go into as much detail and didn't talk about a specific subgenre that I found a little surprising. I kind of expected there to be something in there about it, which is rape revenge as a subgenre, because it's a very well, I won't say it's very popular, but among the people that like it, it is powerfully impactful. And personally, speaking from my own experience, after I was raped, one of the most psychologically cathartic and healing experiences that I had was watching the original I Spit on Your Grave, which is a movie that I have seen extensively criticized because there's like a 30-minute long rape scene in it. But as someone who had just gone through something similar, I found it to be an incredibly powerful release of emotions and tensions watching the main character kill her assailants, and it would not have worked without that extensive buildup. And so I'm curious if you could talk a bit about what you found about that subgenre, and then also why you didn't really talk about that in the book.
I'm glad that I Spit on Your Grave was such a cathartic experience for you. I'm sorry to hear that there was
It's been a
trauma
while.
behind it, right? But I'm glad you found catharsis through the film. Part of the reason why I didn't explore rape revenge too much in the book, or really at all, maybe I dropped a few titles here and there, but it wasn't a focus, was mostly because a lot of the scientific research around it didn't focus on rape revenge as a subgenre. So there wasn't enough research for me to really like aggregate content for a chapter. I talk about violence for sure, and that's where it would have belonged. And
Right.
and certainly I could have explored it a little more in the chapter exploring violence in horror and how we engage with violence in horror. But I think probably one piece of research, I do talk about this in the book, but it's one of the pieces of research that I came across towards the end of writing, which was about processing trauma and grief through watching horror, which
Hmm.
what you're describing sort of reminds me of, where it's it's not only catharsis, but it's seeing a reflection of your own experiences on screen and seeing a character coming out on the other end, either triumphant, having defeated the monster, defeated the villain, or at least having some sort of beyond the experience of grief. Examples that came up were Midsommar was an example that came up, and we could argue that Danny Arter doesn't come out for the better at the end of the experience, but she does come out on the other side of her grief
Yeah.
in arguably a worse position. Um, why can't I remember the Jennifer Kent film that's very famous? The Babadook was another example. There we go. Was another example of exploring grief and coming out at the other end. And so there is a little bit of research on that. And certainly there are a lot of more narrative explorations that have been written about rape revenge, enough that books have been published about rape revenge, but a little less on the science side of horror explorations that I could pull from.
Interesting. I naively would have assumed that it would be a popular subject to study because it I don't know, perhaps my view is tainted by the sort of salaciousness of reading about psychologists like Philip Zimbardo. It seems like the sort of thing that people would want to study, but well, apparently not. Um, One of the things that impressed me while reading Nightmare Fuel is that there were several different times where, as I was reading, you presented some scientific study and a conclusion that was drawn from it. And I read that and I had already known about it. And I went, okay, that is true, but you really need to place it into this broader context where, and then I turned the page and the next thing you said was, and while that is true, we need to place it into this broader context of, which I thought was really good. I liked that a lot. Um, was there anything that you thought you knew before you started researching for the book, but during your research, you learned you were mistaken?
I think one of the most sort of humbling experiences for me while I was writing is I'm a neuroscience nerd by background. I didn't study neuroscience specifically. I studied human biological, human biomedicine, and I came into this book being like, I know how the brain works. Fact is that even neuroscientists who spend day in and day out like studying neurons, studying like functional MRIs, the scans that of brains and brain activity, even they find parts of how the brain works a mystery. And the reason why I started Nightmare Fuel in the first place was because I was so cocky about how the brain worked, is because every year around Halloween, we see articles that come up saying like, this is why we love horror films, and it's because it triggers our fight or flight response. And it's kind of like what you were saying. It was like, well, that's true, but it's not the entire picture. It can't be simplified to that extent, because the fight or flight experience isn't a pleasant experience. So it doesn't explain why we still love horror movies and come back for more. It explains why we might feel a certain rush during certain horror films, and certainly not all of them. And so I jumped into Nightmare Fuel ready and armed to throw down all of my neuroscience knowledge and say, this is exactly how it works, and this is exactly how your brain ticks while you're watching a horror film when you sit down in front of the screen. And I was surprised by a lot of what I learned, and just how complicated that neuroscience is, but also, like I said, humbled by the fact that like there's still a lot left to be explored, and that there are people out there exploring actively.
Yeah, that's a good attitude to have when researching something, I think. Um, so Nightmare Fuel is pretty much entirely about adult horror, like horror films aimed at adults. Uh, how do you perceive horror aimed at adults as different from horror aimed at children. I think I have like one good insight here, but I'd love to have more.
I think the main difference that I would sort of guess at, and again, I don't make horror films, so I don't know exactly what's going on in filmmakers' brains as they set up scripts and set up the imagery that we see. But thinking about what scares kids versus what scares adults is very different, even just based on how we learn and perceive the world at different stages in our lives. So a lot of horror for adults, like think about, we have a whole genre of psychological horror that it tends to be, when I speak to people, one of a lot of folks is like favorite kinds of horror. They love getting their minds bent a little bit and like thinking about those more existential horrors. Whereas, a middle schooler or younger, maybe middle school, they're just starting to think about those more psychological horrors, but younger than that, it's you're not going to necessarily scare a child with like a concept, whereas something big or loud or that jumps out at you or that is visually very dynamic is going to be much scarier to a kid. And I feel like that is the main difference, like in both the visuals, even though we have those elements in adult horror, you can present them with a lot more subtlety and still have it be scary. Whereas for a kid, subtle creeping horror may not quite be it. And I think about the example, I not to use an example from my book, but like my wife was terrified of E.T. as a kid. And it was really like this, it wasn't the idea of this alien being, this pacifist botanist alien being taken up by these agents and held hostage that was scary. It was that this alien looked weird and screamed.
Yeah, all right, fair enough.
It's pretty easy to get a kid that way.
Yeah. I'm working on a children's horror tabletop role-playing game at the moment.
Very cool.
Thank you. And so I've been looking at a lot of children's horror things, and there aren't as many children's horror movies as I kind of expected there to be, but there's quite a lot of children's horror books. And so I've been reading a lot of those, and the pattern that has emerged the most to me that I found really interesting is adult horror is they spend a lot of time setting up the normal, and then the normal is disrupted by this thing. They don't know what it is, and they have to figure it out, and then they have to resolve it. And so adult horror is about what is going on. Whereas children's horror, there's very little time setting up the normal, and then the scary thing is revealed to the child almost immediately, like in chapter 2 of a book. And children's horror is much less about what is going on and more about nobody will believe me about what is going on.
That's a really cool insight.
Thank you.
And that also makes sense that something scary for adults who like, not that children don't crave stability, but like adults like have a bit of a more of an understanding of just how precarious our lives are in terms of like finances and jobs and keeping house and keeping children if we have them and that sort of thing, and sort of establishing normalcy and finding threats to that normalcy. Kids are much more likely to accept what is normal in a given space, right? So like fantasy is so successful with kids because you could say these are the rules of this world, and the kid is like, yes, absolutely, those are the rules of this world. So that aspect makes sense. And as you said, the aspect of kids not necessarily having that confidence that an adult or a guardian figure would believe them if they presented the rules of this world or how things are being shaken up, really speaks to that perspective. That's really cool. I hadn't really spent too much time reflecting on that, but I think that's really neat.
Thank you. Yeah, I find it really interesting because like in a way, in a lot of these stories, half of the horror is the fact that nobody will believe them or help them, and often that is established as being a thing before anything scary happens. That like their brother plays a prank and they get blamed for it. Their parents don't believe them. That sort of thing. The difference being between like with adult horror, the disruption to normalcy is a large part of the horror, and with children's horror, the horror is already there in the normalcy of not being believed, not being taken seriously. Um, Kind of sad that that's apparently like a universal experience for children. But um, so moving back to filmmaking specifically, it kind of seems to me like horror movies push the boundary of filmmaking as a medium more than other genres. But that also might just be my bias because I watch more horror movies than I do other genres. Does that line up with your thoughts? I'm thinking of things like special effects in the 1896 House of the Devil, found footage as a genre, shot on video movies, etc.
Yeah, I would say so. I feel like there's something about there's two elements that kind of allowed horror to have kind of a broader sandbox in terms of like film techniques and experimenting. One is that horror for the longest time wasn't, and still too many in many respects hasn't been considered like a prestige genre, and it's only in like more recent years that we're seeing horror films with big budgets, or coming out of well, there have been horror coming out of larger production houses for the longest time. I mean, the Universal monsters existed in the 1930s, but the idea of like a prestige, large budget horror film hasn't always been the case. And some of the most creative practical effects have come out of horror films with shoestring budgets. And so sometimes having the constraints of being, especially like an independent film, a film with, little means, little budget, you end up with the goopiest, strangest, most creative camera turning upside down, shooting through whatever medium to get certain effects, kind of practical aspects. And I feel like that set up a tradition for horror to have those practical effects be sort of trademarked to the genre, so that and we have horror with like without practical effects, but like fans and true horror fans, not to poo-poo on those who are true horror fans and don't like practical effects, but most true horror fans that I talk to love practical effects.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
look for them and look back to them, and we get excited when we see them. And I feel like that tradition is carried on, especially in like more independent productions. We see that continued on, even if those independent productions do have a budget. The other piece is that horror as a genre, I feel like, and this is again, I don't have the experience as a filmmaker, but from what I understand, it doesn't seem to have the same. It isn't beholden in the same way to the market as other genres are. This is just how I view it. There are obviously like horror coming out of production houses, the ones that tend to come out and like cling to those PG and PG-13 ratings by their like fingertips. Those ones are the ones that try to keep things safer, a little more general, have more in common with like comedies or with like more standard action films. And those are trying to appeal to a global market and want to be, played in international theaters and get that money overseas. But other horror films, and again, more independent horror films, aren't necessarily looking for that same milquetoast approach. Aren't necessarily looking to have a PG-13 rating and be shown to the masses in the same way. Obviously, they still want to be marketable, but don't seem to be targeting the same like financial goals and the same marketing goals as those PG-13 films. And that's just sort of and so because of that, because they aren't trying to adhere to that rating, have a little bit more flexibility to do what they want a little bit more, to play in the sandbox and have a little bit more fun with the genre. That's just my perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. The fact that there's sort of this dedicated audience of horror fans who are less subject to the whims of the day in terms of market forces makes it possible to have a low budget horror film be profitable, and that lets people be more experimental. Thinking about practical effects versus CGI, have you seen the Terrifier series?
That's so funny. I was thinking about the Terrifier series when I was trying to think of different indie films that definitely like go for it. I've seen all of the Terrifier films. I've seen the first one,
Okay.
but certainly
By the first one, do you mean the short film or do you mean the feature?
the feature. I didn't.
Okay.
I haven't seen the short film yet.
Ah.
It sounds like I'm missing out, so I'll get on that right away.
The short film is interesting. It's the most unnerving of the three, in my opinion. The short film, Terrifier 1 and Terrifier 2. It's also the most like strangely misogynistic, which is something that doesn't make sense. It seems incongruous to me with the character of Art the Clown.
Mhm.
Also, Art is portrayed by a different actor, whereas David Howard Thornton has this really excellent background in like dance and theater and mime, which he brings to the physicality of the performance of the character, which is just really excellent. And the person who predates him portraying the character in the short film is not quite as physically talented. So it's worth watching from because it's a historically important film, but it's not my favorite in the series. But specifically on the subject of practical versus CGI, in Terrifier 2, they did something that I thought was very creative and very interesting in combining the two, where there's a scene where a character gets killed in this incredibly elaborate, horrific, ongoing way that where she survives much longer than you would expect. And the way that it's filmed is it starts out with it's just the two actors, Art and the woman, and then we camera angle changes. Now the woman has prosthetic makeup on. Camera angle changes again. The woman is no longer being portrayed by an actor, but is now an animatronic, so that you can have her big holes cut in her body and such. But the thing that they do that makes it especially convincing is, are you familiar with deep fake technology?
Yes, yes.
They deep fake the actor's face onto the animatronic's face. And so she's still able to emote and everything, despite, being in a condition that the actor could not possibly survive. Which is, and the result is quite horrifying. So I think hopefully that sort of creative merging of the two types of effects is where things are going in the future.
And I think that's where it should be. Like, I have no problem with, I think that CG artists are very talented, especially when they're given the money and time that they deserve to make their craft. And I think that VFX are important. But I see just as practical effects are a tool for the medium, I feel like CG is also a tool. It's kind of like one of the various paintbrushes in an artist's toolkit. And with any film media, it's just kind of like thinking about how liberally we brush with that paintbrush.
Yeah. Thinking about how digital technology like that has advanced, and also literal film and video technology has advanced significantly. You go into a bit of the sort of what kinds of horror films were being made in each decade in Nightmare Fuel. And I'm wondering, how did you see the technology that's available to filmmakers changing the kinds of stories that they tell over the years?
Interesting. Are you speaking more in terms of like how we tell the stories, or like you said, what kinds of stories we're telling?
Uh, I was asking more about the latter, but if you have interesting thoughts on either one of them, I'm happy to hear them. I was thinking of,
Sure.
yeah.
Well, certainly like the big thing for the last like 10, 20 years is maybe a stretch now, but is the slasher film has kind of changed forever with the advent of like the cell phone being in everyone's hands. So we can kind of draw a line from that in terms of like how connected we are and how easy it is to access each other, and how it's a lot harder to set up the conceit that you're being stalked by a slasher and have no recourse or no one to reach out to unless you're in the remote woods and your signal is blocked. I think a great example was the film You're Next, where
Ah,
spoilers, the villain has a cell phone jammer in the trunk of his car so that people in this house who should have been connected and should have had signal to call emergency services didn't, except in sort of sporadic moments where signal was found, and was used to like great effect for playing with tension. But I think that's a great example of how we've had to be kind of smarter with how we engage with our monsters, and with like I feel like the slasher genre and like home invasion genre have been, or subgenres have been affected the most, is by like just how much access we have to everything. And then of course you could look at how we engage with technology and social media and horrors there. Like there's a lot of found footage horror that uses those tools to great effect, sometimes better than others. And then there's the whole Black Mirror approach that looks at like, you know, how are we engaging in the worst ways with these technologies? And so those stories are already being told. I'm seeing, probably we'll see uh, more stories told around AI. We've already
hmm.
seen a few pieces, like I guess Megan would be a pretty big one that's come out in recent years, looking at AI in toys. But certainly we'll see some more with AI, I'm sure. And even like you mentioned deep fakes, I'm like, there's something to be mined there, and has been in certain degrees. But yeah, otherwise I can see things going in the other direction, where in order to tell a scary story, people feel like the story needs to strip away technology in some way, like going into an apocalyptic situation where we have no access, in order to set up the conceit of the story.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I've spoken with a lot of different filmmakers about that cell phone question, and um, opinion seems strongly split between either what you were saying of, yeah, we need to come up with reasons why their cell phones aren't helpful to them, um, or considering that to be like kind of the lazy cheating way to do it, and that you really need to ground things in the modern reality where cell phones are these useful tools and still find a way to be scary despite that. Um, it's that definitely seems more challenging than being just like, you're in the woods, you don't have reception because you're in the woods. So it's a tough question. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I guess the way to lean into it is like, you're in the woods, your cell phone works, but no one can get to you because you're in the woods. So now
Yeah.
you have the additional terror of a person at the other end of the phone. That's probably one of my worst nightmares, actually, is being on the other end of a phone and knowing that you can't help. That's like,
Mm.
have you ever seen, I'm dating myself a little bit, but I believe it's a 90s thriller, An Eye for an Eye.
I'm not sure I have.
Okay, well, it's not really spoiling, but the entire opening sequence, or starting of the film, is a mother stuck in traffic on her car phone. It's the 90s, on the car phone with, or maybe it was a cell phone with her daughter at home, and she hears her daughter being brutally raped and murdered in her home, and she can't do anything about it because she's on a cell phone. And the rest of it is a revenge thriller, where
Okay.
she's taking vengeance for her daughter's murder. But like, that is terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, that is. I'm the concept of being stuck somewhere while still being able to communicate reminds me of, I can't remember the name of it. I think it was something very generic like phone booth or something like that, where there's a guy in a phone booth.
Mm.
Remember those? And then there's like a sniper who he's on the
Yeah,
phone with.
that was it was one of the Collins in that one.
Okay,
Colin Farrell?
that sounds plausible. Yeah. And then I saw an indie version of a very similar story set at like a phone booth attached to an isolated gas station, um, which I also can't remember the title of. But yeah, so uh, Nightmare Fuel is specifically about horror films, but it is not specifically about independent horror films, which is what I am pretty much always talking about on this show. And so I'm wondering, do you have any interesting things you've noticed in that draw distinctions between the kinds of horror films that are made or the techniques that are used or anything like that by the low and micro budget independent filmmakers versus the more mainstream Hollywood production companies?
Certainly on the extremely small budget horrors, I've seen definitely more bravery to go for the abstract. I'm thinking
That's
of
interesting.
I'm thinking of like Skinamarink, which wasn't
Okay.
for me, but like certainly was like an abstraction, as far as horror films can go, and certainly was made on a micro budget. And I see sort of what we were talking about before, like a less fear of going for the goopier effects or the more practical effects, maybe because of cost or maybe because of just like the people who are taking on these projects are taking them on because they love the genre uh, more than creating a piece of marketable material. Um, I also think about when I think about indie horror, I also think about a lot of international horror, which also kind of fits into the same remarks that we were saying about leaning more practical. I'm trying to think, was Hatching independent? Have you seen Hatching?
Man, you're good at naming things that I haven't seen, which is uncommon. No, I have not seen Hatching. You're
It's
talking
like,
about the Finnish film from like a year or two ago?
yeah, yeah. It has like the coolest puppets.
That's great.
And it's just like it's slimy, it's goopy, it's very intimate, and that's another thing that you see in a lot of that I think I see, at least in the independent films that I watch, that they have that sort of intimacy to the storytelling. But mostly, I look to like, yeah, they've just got more goop.
Yeah. So I think Hatching was that's an interesting question, is like, does this count as independent or not? Because it was made completely outside of the Hollywood film industry, but that's because it was made in Finland.
Yeah,
It's a Finnish film, and so I would describe it as a pretty mainstream, big budget film for a Finnish film. But compared to like The Conjuring or something, not even close. Uh,
right. Or if you looked at something like New French Extremity,
yeah,
like big films in the New French Extremity, or like yeah, like Pascal Logier's like Martyrs,
yes.
again made outside of Hollywood. And would you consider that under your definition of independent because it's, or would it just be an internationally made film?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what the production of Martyrs was like. To me, the difference between uh, independent and non-independent film is largely about like the did the director make this with the help of an established production company, or
Mm,
did they just like make it and then later it was like acquired for distribution
gotcha.
by a mainstream distribution company? I would consider the latter to be an independent film, even though like sometimes that can make a big difference. Like, for instance, El Mariachi, Robert Rodriguez's first film, was made completely independently for $7,000. And then when it was acquired by, I think it was Miramax, for international distribution, they put another $200,000 into redoing the audio for it. I would still consider that an independent film, even though it was distributed by one of the biggest distributors out there. Um, and yeah, like you just touched on, all of these categories become very muddled when you start talking about non-American films, because what counts as a small budget in America can be a quite large budget in, like, the Philippines.
Mhm.
Um,
And
and
a lot of the international films too are supported either through like grants or by like more like government sort of like this is done by the Film Board of Ireland or something like that, which doesn't quite strike an independent chord in the same way that you just described.
uh, See, I would disagree with you there.
Okay.
I think that, so first of all, you're absolutely right that a lot of those films are supported by their governments. But I think that sort of artistic grant, um, while it can be used by a government to try to, like, create a sort of national identity in art or something like that, often is not, and is just a way for local artists to have something resembling the resources needed to compete with the much wealthier American ones. And I think that, you still get a lot of interesting, unusual artistic visions being created that way, in a way that you see much more compromise with, like, American studio film production. Um, and if anyone listening to this is interested in hearing a bit of behind the scenes stuff about that, my interview with Kevin Kopaka, the director of Dawn Breaks Behind the Eyes, you can go listen to that. That's a German sort of meta modern horror film that was produced in large part by being funded by the German government. Um, And yeah, so you mentioned New French Extremity, and I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how you see uh, horror being expressed differently in different countries, different cultures.
There's ooh, there's
Your
a
eyes widened when I asked that.
well, because New French Extremity is a great example of discussion around French nationalism. There's a
Hmm.
great book on that. I believe it was by Alexander West. That was specifically New French Extremity and French and French nationalism. So, but a lot of a lot of these like nation specific subgenres usually are speaking to to very specific cultural issues. Like I would say found footage, even though it exists now, there exists like found footage examples from various nations. It really is um, embedded in, 9/11 and post 9/11 reactions uh, to technology being observed, paranoia, and those sorts of pieces. Um, and again, like found footage existed before 9/11, but it really had its like boom post 9/11. And so I feel found footage is like a distinctly American subgenre, even though there are great like found footage examples from, you know, South and Central America and like Thailand and that sort of thing. Um,
That's really interesting. Sorry, I want to keep hearing your thoughts, but I've been doing a deep dive on found footage recently, and um, when I think of, like, really the found footage films that are really important historically, um, there's The Connection in 1969, which is not a horror film, uh, and is a very American film. Um, but then, so Blair Witch Project was 1999, which was right before 2001. The Rec series, that's Spanish.
Mhm.
And more recently, uh, Be My Cat, a film for Anne, which I'm going to be interviewing Adrian Sofé later on, so I'm looking forward to
Oh, that's
that.
awesome.
Um,
We accidentally rented that one somehow when I was with my mom.
oh my, yes.
It
Well,
was not what we expected.
yeah, no, definitely not. I'm not sure. Yeah. Um, and that's a Romanian film. And then probably the earliest like recognized as found footage film, despite stuff like The Connection being earlier, is Cannibal Holocaust, and that's an Italian film.
Mhm.
So to me, found footage seems like a very international genre. So I'm curious, like, why do you see it as distinctly American?
I think basically again, like its origins, like you said, are sort of scattered. But when it really got that foothold was when we started seeing like Paranormal Activity. When we saw,
Mm.
it was like Blair Witch really like took it off in or had it take off rather in with American audiences. But um, I'm thinking of sorry, my brain just diverged into like the two thinking about the two post 9/11 subgenres, which the other one, of course, would be like torture porn
Torture.
and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that sort of piece, which is also while has origins in various places, does have a distinctly American bent to it, a post 9/11 bent to it, and those two subgenres sort of align into like when they sort of like grabbed on in our cultural collective and really bloomed domestically. I don't know how to explain it, but when you start like watching found footage horror specifically and think about it in terms of like security increases post 9/11, just like thinking about constant surveillance and the FBI agent in my computer and all of those always being watched elements, they're sort of embedded in the narrative that we see. Also with like the advent of like webcams being more common and technologies, back to that discussion we had earlier about how technology has influenced horror and vice versa. but
Yeah.
but like there's like that surveillance piece that really became a big part of the news post 9/11, and a big part of our reality of like how we navigate the world changed. It just is part of that conversation in found footage.
Yeah. And thinking about national tragedies and how those are addressed in art and affect people's perception of that. I'm thinking about the film Zero Day from 2003. Have you seen that one?
I haven't.
Okay, so it's a found footage film, which I'm gonna assume based on your attitudes in this conversation and in the book that you're not a huge warrior about spoilers.
No, that's fine. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to give
Oh,
spoilers.
no,
I've
no,
been
no.
throwing them out there
This is
left and right.
this is a full spoilers podcast.
Perfect.
Um, so Zero Day is presented as being the video diary of two aspiring school shooters. It is it is them logging their preparation to do a school shooting. Um, and they specifically are recording this with the intention of it being found afterwards. Like they put the VHS tapes in a lockbox in a bank, and then they like send a message to one of their parents saying, "Hey, these tapes are in this bank. You should go get them in a few hours after they do the shooting." And the way you were talking about like surveillance and observation and stuff, the film is in three parts. The first part, which is much longer than the other two, is them preparing for things. The middle part is them actually carrying out the shooting, which they're not recording themselves, but instead we see through the school's security cameras. And then the final part is like some other unrelated uh teenagers who have like I guess a camcorder of their own, desecrating the graves of the two school shooters. Um, and so I found that really interesting because, like, in a sense, it breaks the immersion when you switch from like, oh, this is, this could be their actual video diary that we see, and then we switch to the security cameras. It's like, okay, they didn't stitch these together afterwards in and on an Avid or whatever. This is an edited film now. But I think it still works well in terms of like showing us this different perspective. And and it makes me wonder, like, when did schools get those security cameras in them?
It would have started around the same time if you think it was probably reactionary, like post Columbine, which was
Yeah.
around the same time. That was late 90s,
Yeah,
I
the
believe.
Columbine was 97 and
Yeah.
Zero Day came out in 2003. So
Yeah.
yeah, and it was explicitly inspired by Columbine. The
Yeah.
director has said as much. Uh, yeah,
Which
and
is also a distinctly, again, like school shootings is like sorry, America, but it's a distinctly American narrative.
it is. Yeah, yeah, it's always interesting to me to try to find like subgenres like that and try to use them to understand a bit about the national psyche. Like the two that come to mind for me are Filipino witch films
Mm.
and Italian cannibal films, um, which are a really interesting one to me because I find that there's a lot of people object to Italian cannibal films for the specific reason of the actual ones, not counting the pale imitations like Eli Roth's Green Inferno. Um, but the actual ones frequently depict like an actual hunt of animals where an actual animal gets hunted and killed and butchered. And this is something that people strongly object to, and which I find frequently hypocritical of them, and it bothers me because I if somebody is genuinely principled about this, like they're a vegan, uh, sure, that I accept. But I find most people who object to this are happy to eat a hamburger before they watch the movie, but then they object to seeing a turtle get killed, and and also often are fans of true crime, which I find much more distressing, like personally, but I don't know. Sorry, just going on a little rant there.
Yeah, it's a real life example of that joke from the TV series Community, where Britta says, "I'll excuse racism, but I draw the line at animal cruelty." Uh,
Yeah.
people have a strange relationship to animals where they'll consume them but don't want to be faced with the fact of their consumption, that an animal was killed for them to have that burger, and that animal was probably killed with not without violence. Like, we know that cows in a slaughterhouse are not like being treated to humane conditions before their slaughter. Um, and but we don't like to think about it because we like that cultural disconnect, or that psychological disconnect even of an animal, some blurriness in between, and then a burger on our plate.
Yeah. Yeah. I my partner Al raises chickens, and so I've helped with the slaughter and the butcher of chickens before. And sure, it's an emotional experience, but it's one that I kind of feel like a moral obligation to go through at least a little bit, just because I do eat chickens. And so uh yeah, I find it very frustrating when people aren't willing to face that. And then even more so than that, than when they object to other people depicting the truth of these things.
Mhm. And I think it's important to distinguish that hunting is not animal cruelty. Uh, well, again, some folks might disagree, but like a lot of it's not engaging in the torture of an animal is what I'm
Right.
trying to get at.
Yeah, they're dispatching the animals as efficiently as they can. It's not deliberate cruelty.
Yeah, that's
Um,
what I was trying to define.
Yeah. Yeah, as contrasted with something like The House That Jack Built, which does not depict any actual animal injury on film, but it does depict fictional animal injury. Um, so having looked over this, broad decades long, history of horror and gone into the current state of knowledge in terms of like why people are scared of things and what people are scared of, what do you see as the future of horror films? What do you think we're going to see in the next few years? And if you feel like making predictions any further out than that.
See, I'm terrible at predictions because, like, I know that the films that we're going to see in the next few years are already being shot, are already being made, and so I'm like, I'm sure someone out there knows the secret key to what's going on. So I can only really go by what's already been released and what I'm seeing. And in the past few years, like we've seen a little bit, like we said about like incorporating technology into horror. It's hard for me to tell right now which big monster is coming back because we've had a little bit of vampire resurgence, we've had a little bit of zombie resurgence. Um, we've recently had a lot of like Frankenstein's monster kind of stuff happening with like
Yeah.
Lisa Frankenstein and Poor Things, which are kind of like
Uh,
at the fringes of horror in some ways, but like that's more than one Frankenstein movie in the last.
and the angry black girl and her monster.
Yes. Yes, that's a great example. So like that seems to be sort of the current monster mash that's coming out.
All right.
I think we'll see. I don't think we're done with the socially aware horrors. Like I'm thinking of like again uh looking at bigger movies like Get Out and those sorts of things. It's been a few years, but I feel like we're not done with those conversations in horror, and see more stories that are specifically looking at like Black perspectives or looking at Asian American perspectives, looking at there's been a little bit more physical disability perspective in the last few
Hmm.
years, but I'd like to see more of that. I think that'd be really interesting. Um,
Yeah, I watched Secret Santa last last winter and interviewed the director of that, and one of the uh lead characters in that, and the lead actor who portrays him as well, uh has a stutter, which is something that I very rarely see depicted in fiction like at all, even though like the president of the United States has a stutter. uh and so I'd be really interested to see more of that. And talking about depiction of disability, that's really interesting because uh I from people who are not horror fans and are not actually informed on the genre, there often seems to be this sort of misperception that horror is a sort of uh, bigoted genre that is shown exclusively from the dominant able-bodied male gaze sort of thing, when I really, in my experience, I haven't found that to be the case. Like, um one of the characters in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is in a wheelchair,
mhm.
and so is one of the characters in one of the Friday the 13th films, and like
We have a
dark.
Nightmare on Elm Street film with a deaf character.
Yeah, and just recently, Dario Argento did Dark Glasses, which is about a woman becoming blind because of an accident, and also she has like a stalker, and the scary part is the stalker, but like the middle third of the movie is about her adjusting to being blind, and it's really good. And I don't see that kind of thing in other genres. Um, what do you think about like the both how disability is presented in horror films, and how, yeah, I don't know. I brought up a bunch of stuff. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting perspective. Certainly, like horror is guilty, of course, of perpetuating fear against people with facial differences or limb differences, because we have, of course, equated monstrosity and villainy with those things.
Yeah,
We
that's
like I'm thinking
yeah.
even why is Midsommar in my brain today? But even thinking about like the sort of like quote unquote idiot savant character in Midsommar that has
Mm,
like facial differences. They're not a villain, but they're treated as like this sort of outsider figure, even with
scary.
from scary from within the Harga. And I think that was that. I think it stuck in my mind because it stood out to me where I was like, why is this character here, and do they need to be there? Are they there just to be shocking in some way? And which is something that has happened throughout horror, but at the same time, like you've said, we tend to see more diversity in characters in horror. Do they always survive till the end? No. Um, do they always have to? No. Um, but all things being equal, we do see more variety in the kind of characters and stories being told in horror just in general. And I don't know if it's because like that's who was accessible at the time to make the film, or if that was something that was like someone's conscious thought of like, I want to tell these stories because they're never told, or wouldn't it be neat if we told this story, or if there was some other push to tell those stories. I don't know, but I think I see both sides of the horror arguments. Just I think you're right that most people tend to think about disability as monstrosity or chronic illness as monstrosity and stop there without thinking about just how rich the horror genre is and all its various subgenres and all the various stories it tells, because it tends to deviate from that standard straight cis white guy story perspective, and has for a very long time. Like you've just cited examples that go back into like the 70s uh, in terms of bringing in other characters.
Yeah. And in terms of avoiding the perspective of the straight cis white guy, one of my favorite horror movies is the 1961 movie Homicidal. Have you seen that one? It's a
I
William Castle.
haven't.
Oh,
It's a Castle movie.
it's a William Castle movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this one, for anyone who's not familiar with William Castle, he was a director and producer whose his shtick was coming up with gimmicks for the films. So he did like Spine Tingler, where they would install like little vibrators in some of the seats and make you think that the monster from the movie is in the theater. And the thing with Homicidal was the fright break, where if you get 90% of the way through the movie and then there's an intermission where if you're too scared to see the ending, you can leave now and get your money back. And but leaving all that aside, it's also a really fascinating depiction of gender, because spoilers, it is a mystery thriller horror sort of slasher film. The murders aren't depicted quite explicitly enough for it to really be a slasher film, but precursor of that sort of thing, about um a woman serial killer and the male main character who is trying to catch her, and then the reveal is they're the same person.
Ooh.
And uh and it's really interesting because I mean they're portrayed by the same actor, but you can't tell. And it's that one and uh Sleepaway Camp are two really interesting ones in terms of like I've in terms of depiction of gender and the oppressive nature of being coerced into specific gender roles and how that can fuck somebody up psychologically. Um, and ones that especially Sleepaway Camp, I think are frequently misunderstood. Um, have you seen? I assume you've definitely seen Sleepaway Camp. Have you seen all
Oh,
the sequels?
absolutely. I haven't seen all the sequels, but I've absolutely seen the first one.
Okay. Have you seen any of the sequels?
No, I haven't.
Okay. So in a lot of people like 2 and 3 because they're like they lean into the comedy aspect of it and they're extremely campy. Uh which not quite my preference. I love a good campy film like Pink Flamingos, etc. But I think the slightly more serious of the first one and Return to Sleepaway Camp, which 2 and 3 are made by completely different people, writer, director, actors, practically unrelated to the other ones. But the original and Return are made by the same writer director, and both star Felissa Rose as the main character. Um, and uh, for anyone unaware, the story of Sleepaway Camp is that this uh, young male child, after the death of their parents, was raised as a girl by their mentally disturbed aunt, and this is psychologically damaging to them. Um, and then in Return to Sleepaway Camp, that character is living as almost like an assigned male at birth trans man,
Fascinating.
if you see what I mean. Uh, and I think,
Interesting. That's really interesting. Because I always wondered that after watching the first one was like, because clearly the character, like you said, is psychologically damaged from the experience. But I was like, how much of that identity is like reconciled with like how they actually feel or how they actually see themselves? Okay.
yeah, yeah. So the second and third one basically treat the character as just a regular adult woman. But then Return to Sleepaway Camp has uh Felissa Rose like as a drag king basically throughout the majority of the film. Um, and I think it's really interesting stuff that I think gets sort of treated pure on a surface level too often. Um, so uh do you have any specific movies you would recommend in terms of like getting people to look at these perspectives that are not often seen in mainstream media?
Oh gosh, I would have to think about this.
I realized I'd been ranting for too long and needed to like give you another chance.
No, that's okay. I'll have to think about this. So let's come back to that because
Okay.
I've trying. Oop, I'm trying to think of examples that I've seen that like really resonated. But it's one of those things where it's like as soon as you get asked what your favorite movie is, it's like I've never seen a movie in my entire life.
Oh yeah, I have stock answers ready for that. My favorite movie is Metropolis. My favorite horror movie is The Wicker Man, etc. Um, are there any movies that you've seen that were not really explicitly intended as horror films, but which nevertheless scared you? Like you mentioned your wife being scared by E.T. Did you have any sort of similar experiences?
Not the same thing where it was like I was a child and scared by something, but I mean, to me, the scariest film ever made is Requiem for a Dream.
Hmm. That's
Not
the
intent.
drug addiction one?
That's the drug addiction one. Yeah, Aronofsky. It's not meant to be a horror film, but I perceive it, and it's not filmed like a horror film, but it is absolutely horrific, and it's given me nightmares. And I haven't watched it since probably around like 2006. I saw it when I
Hmm.
was in university, like just hanging out in the dorm room with my friend who was obsessed with Jared Leto, and and so I was like, sure, I'll watch this movie, and it scarred me for life. Specifically, it was the story of
The old
the
woman?
the old woman with the speed diet pills. Yeah, the
Oh
methamphetamines. Or
God. Yeah, no, I agree. Anything that's about the deterioration of someone's faculties really stresses me the heck out.
yeah, and like I've always been freaked out by narratives like with like yeah that loss of control, loss of faculties, but also that like loss of control over one's body, that deterioration of body.
Hmm.
So like plots like on a lighter side, like Stephen King's Thinner. Ugh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
don't like
yeah.
it.
Yeah, no. Um, have you personally benefited psychologically from any horror films or other horror media?
not to like the intense degree of like processing trauma through horror or anything like that, but I've certainly benefited from comfort horror in times of like when I've really had a bad day. I've turned to horror instead of a comedy to sort of get that cathartic effect.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've found kind of interesting is I've always ended up liking horror films that are about things I'm scared of more than I expect to. I don't know if that makes sense. I've always had been like totally deterred by the idea of cannibalism.
Hmm.
And so it took me forever to get to Julia Ducournau's film Raw, because I was like, can't do it. It's cannibalism. I won't be able to watch it. And then it ended up being like one of my favorite films I had seen that year. So there's a certain amount of like body horror and disgust that I've been able to like navigate thanks to horror films specifically. But
Yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting. I have a phobia of swarms of insects, and
Mm.
and uh and so I have like the nest and they nest and ticks and slugs on my to watch list, but I haven't gotten around to them. Um, but uh, but in movies that I wonder how much like I haven't gotten around to them specifically because I expect them to freak me out a whole lot, and so I need to be in the right headspace before I watch them. But when I think about movies that have just sort of incidentally depicted like swarms of insects, the two that come to mind are Indiana Jones 4 and The Green Inferno, both of which have CGI ants. And it is specifically ants that freak me out the most out of any swarm. Um, but neither one of those really freaked me out because they both looked fake to me. And so I wonder, like, when thinking about psychological benefits or the psychological impact of watching a movie like this, to what degree do you think believability of the visuals and of the narrative affects that sort of thing? Because like if either of the scenes in those movies had actually happened, that would be intensely horrifying to me. But watching a CGI version of it happen is not.
Yeah. And I think I think it does make a big difference as soon as you're able to be like, that's not real. Um, it's a little bit easier to make that disconnect when, like you said, it's like very clearly CG insects or very clearly a CG snake. Snakes are something that people have a lot of problems with. Spiders too. Spiders are special,
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
in terms of like how people react when they see them. I work at a science center during the day, and we have both snakes and tarantulas in our science center, and I think it's fascinating to see just how many people will like avoid those floors completely, like the entire floor where there are snakes,
Oh
just because
wow.
they can't bear to see them, even if the snakes are on the other side of like a glass enclosure.
Huh.
Um,
Okay.
it's really really interesting. So certainly the real thing, and just seeing the real thing, even though you know that it's controlled and perfectly safe, that is like the first step to exposure therapy usually, but it's still a really hard step for some people to take. And I think that's the difference between having something that's like very obviously fake in a horror movie and showing like watching like The Craft and seeing like a ton of real snakes, like hundreds of real snakes coming out of a toilet.
Yeah.
That might be more challenging for someone with a fear of snakes to watch than something like one of the Anaconda films where it's like clearly a rubber snake or clearly a CG snake that's leaping out of the explosion.
Yeah, the talking about snakes coming out of the toilet, I immediately thought of Hard Ticket to Hawaii. Have you seen that?
No?
Oh, so it's not a horror film. It's an action film. It's a very cheesy, campy action film. That it has one of those sort of false endings where like you think the narrative is over, but then hey, remember this snake from like the first 15 minutes of the movie? It exploded out of the toilet, and it's this 10-foot long puppet, and and it's amazing. It's a very entertaining movie. I definitely recommend it.
This is going back for a second, but the only sort of it's a mainstream example, but I thought of Run, which stars it's the Sarah Paulson movie with where she plays mother to a it's like a Munchausen by proxy situation, and her daughter uses a wheelchair, and the actress herself also uses a wheelchair for mobility, and other walking aids as well. So I thought that was an interesting movie in terms of how we get to see someone in that hero role escaping a dangerous situation without the standard mobility to escape that you would think about, like being able to run away, to be able to escape a house, to be able to get up and down stairs, or like I think at one point she climbs out a window and goes across her roof to try and get out of the house. And like, that's hard enough for a person with like full mobility, but to have someone with a physical disability doing those things.
Yeah.
It was a fun, well, maybe not fun movie, but it was a really interesting perspective in a thriller.
Yeah. That sounds similar to the Dario Argento film I mentioned a few minutes ago, Dark Glasses, where there are a lot of situations where it's like you as the audience can see like, oh, this character should go over that way or something, but the character is blind and can't see that opportunity. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm definitely gonna have to check that out. So one of the things that you talked about in the book, which I mentioned earlier, is how the anxieties of different decades produce different kinds of films. That like the 1950s, there was the anxiety over nuclear power and nuclear weaponry, and what are mutations going to be like? And this produced like the giant monster subgenre, which we've recently seen make a bit of a comeback in terms of like there's the American Godzilla films, which are really not horror films, they're action movies, but then much more so with Shin Gojira and Godzilla Minus One recently. And I found those movies both very interesting. And of the two, I like Shin Godzilla more, I think probably in large part because it's set in the present day. And so I was wondering, so first of all, is there a subgenre from the past like that that's not really made anymore, like giant monster movies that you would like to see a comeback for? And then I have another question about which I'll get to in a minute.
Ooh, that's a great question. I would like to see. Ooh. We haven't really seen too much of. Oh, we have though. We saw resurgence in the 90s. I was thinking of like that sort of like communism pod people kind of movie, but we did see that kind of come back in the 90s a little bit with like disturbing behavior, and in the early 2000s where they redid the Stepford Wives again.
Yeah, and the I love that subgenre. The title of this podcast is Invasion of the Pod People, which is actually the name of a specific one of those movies that I unfortunately only learned about like 2 weeks after I picked the title of the podcast. But yeah, that's definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, it's that whole, and I think it has resonance today too, of just like not being sure of your neighbors. I think of how we're so exposed to like world events and people landing very firmly on different sides of very contentious topics, and not really knowing what you can talk to your colleagues about, or talk to your, even sometimes your friends about, and
That's
know
relatable.
if that'll like change your relationship forever if you broach certain topics. I don't know. That's something I've been struggling with recently, and I feel like there's something to the like pod person element to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and definitely very relatable. I've definitely felt stressed thinking about like can I talk about this subject or not? Should I even should I have an opinion about this, given that it doesn't directly affect me and I cannot directly affect it? Uh, yeah.
The other one that I think would be sort of a return to the sort of not necessarily pregnancy horror, but like reproductive rights horror that we saw in like the 60s and early 70s, like with like sort of women's rights movements and like the advent of the birth control pill and like fears around that sort of agency being given to people with uteruses. But like because reproductive rights have been a really big thing right now and is really just like in the news and in terms of discussions and how those things might end up being controlled by government bodies in ways that they were in the past, but we thought would never be the case again. There's a case for that being a very real fear that can be visited in horror again, which I'm sad that that's a horror that we can revisit these days, because I thought we were, maybe not looking back after Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. I'm thinking about a pair of movies. One from back then. When was Roe v. Wade decided originally?
73.
73. Yeah. Okay. So the timing is really great there. A pair of movies that I would recommend on that subject: the 1974 film "It's Alive."
Yes.
And the 2016, so I guess a little prescient film, Prevenge.
I love Prevenge. It's so good. It's so clever.
Yeah. So, oh man, that's a yeah. The second half of the question I was going to ask you was, do you see social issues or social anxieties at the moment that are not being addressed in film? And then you just already answered that. So yeah.
It's a big one, I think. I think for sure.
So, sorry, what's a big one?
Like that in terms of like reproductive rights. I think also we still haven't gotten there in terms of like we've seen more films kind of like taking on like queer issues and trans issues in like more like cheekier senses, like in more of the horror comedy range. But I haven't seen too much that's like, I've seen it in books. I'm thinking of like Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt is a good example of a book that's looking at like trans issues in horror.
Okay.
But less so in film.
Yeah. One movie that I would recommend, which I interviewed the writer-director of, Christopher Wesley Moore, is Children of Sin. It is set at a gay conversion camp, and is it's very unsettling. Definitely recommend it. Yeah. Well, I could keep coming up with more questions in eternity. We've already been talking for more than an hour. Is there anything specifically that that you would like to talk about, or that you would have liked to include in Nightmare Fuel that that we haven't brought up yet?
No, I think we covered everything. I think I want to leave some of the book for folks to read and to explore on their own. I think the coolest or like the most important thing or takeaway about Nightmare Fuel is that we love horror, and there are a lot of scientific ideas as to why we love horror, just psychologically and physiologically, as to why when we plop ourselves down and say, let's get scared, it actually turns into something enjoyable for most people, not everyone. But also that it's such a complex cascade of factors that lead to us to love horror or hate it. And that science is still exploring exactly all the whys as to that.
Yeah, okay, there's a question I would like to end on. Why is it that some people just hate horror?
Well, I think, and like take this with a grain of salt, because I'm sure there are myriad reasons why a person loves, or rather, take that again. So take this with a grain of salt, because I'm sure there are myriad reasons why someone hates horror. It can come from like their own emotional state when they sit down to watch the show or a movie. It can come from trauma. Just putting that all aside, it could be okay. Two ideas that come to mind. One would be the no, scratch that. I'm just going to go with one idea, just one idea, and I think
Right.
it comes from the sort of leading reason why we think that people can transform uh, that sensation of fear that you get from that like fight or flight response, that adrenaline pumping, into enjoyment, and that's known as excitation transfer theory. So I'm getting a little bit scientific now. Excitation transfer theory is very basically that when you are presented with some sort of scary stimulus, so something that is scary that you're seeing on screen, your body and brain react with only the context of there's something scary, and gets your body prepared to deal with it. So that's a state of arousal, not the sexy kind of arousal, but like just like excitation. And once you get a little bit more context, like, hey, I'm in front of a TV screen, I'm watching a movie in the safety of a theater or my own home, then your conscious brain, your conscious thinking takes over and takes that high excitation state and transfers it over into enjoyment, because you have to, or pleasure rather, but you have to take that energy, that excitation, and put it somewhere. So it goes from fight or flight and gets moved into pleasure. And for some people, this is actually a really funny kind of digression, but there was one person who posted about my book on Tumblr once, and they were like, I picked up this book wondering if it would explain to me why I get horny when I watch horror films. And I had made a joke in the book being like, just like I did now, being like, it's not the sexy kind of arousal. And they're like, so I'm disappointed that it didn't explain it to me. But unfortunately, it is the same theory. It's just instead of going from fight or flight excitation to pleasure excitation, it's going from fight or flight excitation to horny excitation for that particular person. So you can't always control what path it takes. And so to get back to the original question, I think that some people, and again, there's no science to back up what I'm saying yet, yet. But I think that there's something in that mechanism that might be flawed, where people who are hitting that fight or flight state, that high anxiety, high excitation state while watching a horror film, even when giving the extra context of being in the safety of their own home, aren't necessarily exiting from that fight or flight state into a pleasure state. That arousal doesn't change states in a way that is pleasurable. They kind of stay in that this is bad, things are bad state. And because of that, maybe, or they may get changed into a different arousal state like disgust, which is still negative. And because of that, they just don't get the enjoyment out of it that they could be.
Okay. So that prompts an interesting question, which is, you're talking about how that the transferal happens because of the combination of experiencing the intense anxiolytic emotions, and then also knowing that you're in this fictional context and are able to distance yourself from it by that means. Does that imply that movies where you are unsure of the reality of it in some way would not have that effect?
Can you give
And
an
so,
example
uh,
of?
yeah, so the two that come to mind are the Blair Witch Project, before people knew that it was a fictional film, and Faces of Death, which is a has a little bit of which is an anthology film series that supposedly depicts people dying in a bunch of different ways. Some small minority of the examples in the films are um, have footage of actual accidents where people died, but most of them are, basically fictional short films that were shot showing a character dying using special effects, but it didn't actually happen. But they were presented to the audience as though they were all real things that actually happened, and a lot of people believed it. Um, and then other things, even like with Cannibal Holocaust, where the director got charged with murder because the courts thought that it was a real, actual found footage film. Um, yeah, how would actually believing something like that affect the transferal experience?
I think it's a complicated answer, but I do think it would extend the horror of the experience, not necessarily the terror. Terror is like that first knee-jerk reaction or the pre-scare feeling that you have. Or am I getting things mixed up?
I always find any sort of distinctions between those things that people make to be, um, if not necessarily arbitrary, then at least inconsistent from person to person. And so,
I was
I'm
trying to go with the Anne Radcliffe definition, which comes
okay.
from Gothic literature, and I believe it's like terror is that creeping feeling leading up to the scare, and horror is the response to the scare. But you're right, definitions vary. But I think there's some extension to the horror of it, and I'm thinking too of parallels to seeing dead bodies on the news and the horror that comes with knowing that those bodies are real. Um, there's always the question of like whether we're desensitized to seeing these things, and I don't think that the argument for desensitization is as strong as we think it is for real events.
Yeah.
Um, certainly, we can expect to see those things in real life context, like on the news and that sort of thing, especially with current events. But it doesn't stop them from being horrific. And I think in the context of a film where you don't know that those things are fiction, that it extends that horror. Maybe you can still have some comfort that comes from the remove that you have from watching it within the comfort of your own home or in a theater, and having that separation from the media in that way. It's still different from experiencing something in person in real life. But in terms of the persistence of that horror after consuming it, I I suspect that there would be a difference there.
Yeah. The topic of seeing a body and knowing that it's real, and the fact that you can distance yourself from a movie because you know that it's fiction, that got me thinking about the horror movie that has stuck with me the most, which is the 1998 Hong Kong film Men Behind the Sun. Have you seen that?
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, it's very intense. It's about Unit 731, which is sort of the Japanese mad science division during World War II, which was a real organization that really did the things that are depicted in the film. Um, and so, in that sense, you already have this like, sure, this is a fictional film, but it's the fictional film depicting real events. But then also, this is the only film I've ever watched with a friend of mine who I watched quite a lot of films with, where one of us called for it to stop watching it partway through, because there's a scene in the film where a child is vivisected, um, which for anyone who doesn't know the specific vocabulary words, vivisecting is like dissecting, except that the person that it's happening to is still alive. Um, And that footage, the footage that is used in that scene, is of an actual child autopsy. It's a
Mhm.
real human body being cut apart on screen. Obviously not a living one, but still the fact that it's this so intensely realistic moment makes it incredibly distressing. And it's not even the most distressing moment in the film from my perspective, although everybody seems to have a different scene that stuck with them. Um, but it's a really intense movie, and it's really fascinating to me as like sort of tying together a lot of the things that we've been talking about. It's a Chinese film, in a sense. It was made by Hong Kong in the 80s, so not technically part of China. But it's very much about like a specific Chinese trauma that was suffered. And yeah, definitely worth watching if you think you can stomach it.
Yeah, I'll add it to the list for sure. I'll save it for a rainy day. On a
Oh,
lighter note, since you mentioned vivisection, just a funny story is I've been, like I said, I've been working at a science center. I've been working at the science center for about 12 years. But when I did my first job interview, I was super nervous and I was asked to describe workshops around the human body because the science center was getting Gunther von Hagen's Body Worlds as an exhibition.
okay.
And then I started talking about how people have always been fascinated by the inner workings of the human body, and that's why there's a history of vivisection. And then I had to stop and backpedal and say, like, not that I'm saying that we should do vivisection as a workshop in our science center. That would be unethical. Somehow I still got the job.
Oh man. And on that happy note, uh, so Nightmare Fuel, it's available in many places where books are sold. It's available both in hardcover and digital. There's an audiobook version. Where else would you like to direct anyone listening to this?
Pretty much anywhere you'd like to buy books, you can access Nightmare Fuel. It also, I believe, recently I'm not sure if this happened yet, but I think it's on demand soft cover as well. If you
Oh,
really need it to be soft cover, but I know that's either in the works or might have already happened. But most places it's hardcover, but I think that's a recent development. But otherwise, yeah, it's hopefully it's in your local library where you can check it out. If you aren't in the book buying mode, I'm just rambling now. You can check out
do you
Tor
have
Nightfire, which is my publishing group. I'm published under Tor Nightfire. They have some cool stuff that's not me as well.
yeah, do you have like social media or anything you would like to direct people to, or
I do. Unfortunately, my username is annoying to pronounce if you're not French, and it's annoying to spell, but it's C'est ma biologie, which is French for "it's my biology." It's a reference to the television series Orphan Black, but also to my French heritage and also background in human biomedical biology. So it's just like it's a great username in that respect, but otherwise it's terrible for trying to share it with others.
yes, and The Science of Orphan Black is the book that you wrote before The Science of Horror Films.
It is. That's like a whole other story because it was basically like a nerd dream to write the official science companion for a television series that I loved.
Yeah, I have several of the Science of Star Trek books and things like that. So it's a great genre. All right, well, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about the science of horror films.
Thank you so much.